In this video, I'll be looking at the Canon EF-S 10 to 18mm and the EF-S 10 to 22mm lenses when used on a full-frame camera. I'll be looking at their native performance and also how well they work with a teleconverter and the Laowa Magic Shift Converter, both of which enlarge the image circle of the lens. To start with, why would you want to use one of these lenses designed for APS-C size sensors on a full-frame camera? Well, they're smaller, lighter, and much cheaper than full-frame lenses. The main reason for me, though, is that both my Sony cameras have better video specs when used in APS-C crop mode than they do when used without a crop. If these lenses work well on full-frame, then it would allow using them for both wide-angle APS-C crop video and wide-angle full-frame stills or video. Now, at least with the Sigma MC11 adapter I use to mount Canon EF lenses on my Sony E-mount cameras, you cannot attach an EF-S lens, though there are some adapters out there that are compatible with EF-S lenses. So I purchased EF mounts for both of these lenses to convert them to EF mount. I thought that possibly these may also allow for a slightly wider image circle than the native EF-S mounts. So to modify the 10 to 18mm for EF mount, you need to remove the 4 mount screws and 2 small screws that secure the electrical contacts block to the mounting ring. Then remove the mounting ring and replace that with the new ring. Reuse the existing screws for reattaching the electrical contacts block to the new mounting ring. And then I used the screws provided with the new mount for screwing down the mount, but it probably doesn't actually matter, but the provided silver coloured screws do match the new silver coloured mount. The new mount is very tight when mounting the lens on an adapter, but it does fit. It is so tight that it does make lens swapping more difficult than it should be, and on the Laowa MSC it's a real struggle to mount or dismount the lens. As I only bought one of these mounts, I don't know if I just got one where the tolerances are off or if they're all like this. While there are multiple sellers of the EF mount kit for this lens, I'm not sure if they're all from the same manufacturer or if there are different manufacturers where one may be better than the other. Moving on to the 10 to 22mm EF mount modification. This one is a lot more complicated. First of all, you need to remove the 4 mount screws and 2 small screws that secure the electrical contacts block as before. I then spent ages trying to remove the mount before I realised that the inner ring needed removing to release the electrical contacts block from the metal mount ring. To do this, gently lift up the mount at an angle so you can see underneath it. The black plastic inner ring of the lens mount is secured to the metal part with clips. You need to try and prise this inner ring off, pushing it up through the hole in the metal mount. I broke one of the plastic clips when trying this, so try and be a bit more careful than me. Once you've done this, then hopefully both the inner black plastic ring and the metal mount will remove easily, while leaving the electrical contacts block in place. Next, I spent ages trying to get the contacts block to fit correct in the new mount, when all that was actually needed was to do the opposite of what was needed to disassemble the old mount. So you need to undo the 3 small screws holding the middle plastic part onto the metal part of the new mount. When doing this, try and keep the metal mount aligned to the lens so everything will line up correctly when screwing it back together. With the metal mount on the lens, screw in the electrical contacts block, then add the inner plastic piece and screw that back in. Finally, screw the mount onto the lens using the screws the original mount came with, not the ones supplied with the new mount. I found the supplied screws stuck out slightly, even though they're shorter than the originals, and this made it so that the lens couldn't be mounted on a camera or adapter. With the original screws, the lens mounts fine and doesn't suffer from an extra tight fit like the 10 to 18mm with the replacement mount does. And here are what the lenses look like with their original EF-S mounts, and then after modification with the replacement EF mounts. Now we'll look at vignetting pre versus post mount conversion. This test is to see if the EF mount conversion actually reduces vignetting at all, or if it makes no improvements other than allowing the use of a lens on an adapter that is not compatible with EF-S lenses. We can see from these tests that yes, the EF mount conversion does reduce vignetting. It's not just simply making the lens so that it can use an EF mount. Rather annoyingly, on Canon bodies, when it detects an EF-S lens is attached, it will force an APS-C crop with no way to turn this off. To avoid this, you can dismount the lens slightly, just enough so that it's not locked. This breaks the electrical contact between the lens and the body, so the body no longer knows what lens is mounted, and it will not force an APS-C crop. However, both these lenses have an electronic aperture, so you have no way of setting the aperture when used like this. And you have the same issue when you are using a dumb adapter with no electronic contacts, like the Laowa Magic Shift Converter. And to make matters worse, the 10 to 18mm is a focus by wire lens, meaning that you cannot adjust the focus without any electrical contact. To work around this, you need to get the lens in a state where the aperture and focus are actually set at the correct values you want before you disconnect it from the camera body. This should be possible to do by dismounting the lens while holding the DOF preview button. However, on my R5, the depth of field preview button doesn't seem to do anything. I'm not sure if this is normal or if it's just something wrong with my camera. Instead, you can set the focus and aperture, then remove the lens while taking a photo, which means that you'll need to set a few second exposure to give you enough time to remove the lens during the exposure. Or you can put the camera in video mode and just disconnect the lens while it's in video mode. With the 10 to 18mm on my Canon R5, which forces an APS-C crop, and with a Maker RF to EF adapter and continuous autofocus turned on, focus is adjusted as you zoom. But with the lens disconnected, we find that sadly the 10 to 18mm is very much not parfocal. Given the fact that you can't manually adjust the focus on this lens without electronic communication, this is a big shame. If the lens could just be set to near infinity and then stay there throughout the focal range, this would make it much more usable on a dumb adapter in my opinion. When connected electronically to the camera and with the lens set to manual focus, you still get focus shift when adjusting the zoom, but much less focus shift than when there is no electronic connection. On my Sony camera with the Sigma MC11 adapter, which does not support continuous autofocus for EF mount lenses, then manual focus with the lens connected electronically does not cause any focus shift, so it actually works better than it does on Canon. With the lens disconnected, we see the same big shift in focus as you zoom. Similar to the 10 to 18mm, if you have continuous autofocus enabled, the 10 to 22mm will adjust focus as you zoom. But with the lens disconnected, the focus will drift as you zoom. When you use manual focus with the lens connected, the focus drift while zooming is much the same as you see with the lens disconnected. The lens at 22mm actually looks more out of focus on the shot with the lens connected, but I think this is only because this is an APS-C crop and so you're viewing a magnified image. On Sony with the MC11 adapter we do see focus shift, and disconnected on Sony we get the same result. So the 10 to 22mm does not seem to be parfocal, however it has much less focus drift than the 10 to 18mm. You can manually focus this lens on a dumb adapter anyway, so you can just adjust the focus manually. One more thing to note when looking at these clips is that we see flickering while zooming when the lenses are electronically connected. This doesn't really bother me as it is extremely unlikely that I would want to zoom either of these while recording video. Now we'll look at image quality. All the following test images were shot at f8 and focused near infinity. The shots using the Magic Shift Converter and the teleconverter were also shot at f8, which is an effective aperture of f11. Photos were shot in RAW and converted in Adobe Camera Raw with chromatic aberration correction turned on. The EF-S 10 to 22mm on full frame is usable from 15mm onwards, but it's very soft at the edges. The edges improve more the longer the focal length, but even at longer focal lengths, the edges are still noticeably soft. The EF-S 10 to 18mm on full frame is usable from 14mm, but very soft at the edges. Again, the longer the focal length, the better the edges get, but even at longer focal lengths, the edges are still noticeably soft. And now we'll look at some crops comparing the two lenses so we can better compare them. The 10 to 18mm at 15mm on full frame is noticeably sharper away from the centre, than the 10 to 22mm at 15mm. Now let's look at the images shot full frame and then cropped in post by 1.6 times versus images shot in camera with an APS-C crop. The full frame images were shot on my Sony camera and the in-camera cropped ones were shot on Canon. So there are some colour differences between the two. But mainly I wanted to look at how the application of the lens profile corrections applied to the in-camera cropped images compared to the uncorrected manually cropped full frame images. When comparing native APS-C shots from the lenses versus full frame shots cropped to APS-C in post, I don't see much of a difference. I assume that applying one of the lens profiles to a full frame image taken with the lens applies an APS-C lens profile, and so distortion and vignetting corrections would not be correct. However, unlike some modern lenses designed for mirrorless, these lenses do not appear to rely heavily on software corrections. I can't detect things getting overly warped or stretched wrongly when looking at these test images with no profile applied, or applying a profile to them when looking at a full frame image. The Laowa Magic Shift Converter allows mounting an EF lens on a Canon RF mount camera. They also offer the same adapter with a Nikon F lens mount, and on the camera mount side it is available for Sony E and Nikon Z mounts. What is special about this adapter is that it includes a 1.4 times teleconverter and allows shifting the lens. The idea is that you use a full frame lens with it, and the 1.4 times magnification enlarges the image circle of the lens enough to allow you to shift the lens without really bad vignetting. When using it with a lens designed for APS-C instead, what happens is that it enlarges the image circle so that it just about covers full frame. Canon APS-C is a 1.6 times crop compared to the 1.4 times magnification of the MSC. The Magic Shift Converter has no electrical contacts. Using the 10 to 18mm lens on it was an absolute nightmare to try and get the focus set correctly. Both the 10 to 18mm and 10 to 22mm cannot be used at their widest focal lengths, as the rear glass of the lens physically touches the glass inside the MSC. For the 10 to 18mm this happens at 11mm, so 12mm onwards should be safe to use, and for the 10 to 22mm lens this happens at 12mm, so 13mm onwards with that lens should be safe to use. The Laowa Magic Shift Converter has a notable cool colour shift compared to the native lens. However, we see the colour temperature warm up when shifting the lens. This could potentially be down to the filter I was using on the lens, rather than something inherent with the MSC. My Canon R5 that this test was done on is a full spectrum converted camera, and so requires using a filter on it to get normal visible light images. With these images, a step-up ring and 82mm filter was mounted on the lens, and so vignetting may be worse than what you would get without a filter. One potential problem when using shift is that lateral CA is not easily correctable. Since the lens is no longer centered, the CA will be stronger on one side of the image than the other. However, I don't see any bad chromatic aberration with these lenses and the Magic Shift Converter. And the image quality is not good enough at the edges that you'd want to use shift with these lenses anyway. Note that you do lose a stop of light with the MSC. Next, looking at the 10 to 18mm lens with the Laowa Magic Shift Converter versus the 10 to 18mm lens in APS-C mode. The field of view on the Magic Shift Converter is wider than the same focal length in APS-C cropped. This does make sense since the Magic Shift Converter is a 1.4 times magnification, while Canon APS-C is a 1.6 times crop. I'd say 11mm on the Magic Shift Converter is a bit wider than 10mm APS-C, which matches up to the calculated effective focal lengths. 11 times 1.4 is 15.6, while 10 times 1.6 gives us 16mm equivalent. The Magic Shift Converter looks softer at the pixel level than APS-C, but it does look better when both are matched to the same display size. Now looking at the 10 to 22mm lens with the Magic Shift Converter versus the 10 to 22mm lens with an APS-C crop. The results here are pretty much the same as with the 10 to 18mm lens. The lens used normally with an APS-C crop has better pixel level sharpness than when shot full frame with the Magic Shift Converter, but when normalised to the same display size, the images with the Laowa have more detail, with the possible exception of the very edges and corners of the frame, which I think do look a bit better in the APS-C image. Now we'll look at the EF-S lenses plus the Magic Shift Converter versus a full frame 16 to 35mm lens. I took test shots with my Canon 16 to 35mm f4 lens so we can compare against a lens that's designed for full frame. Comparisons here are with the EF-S lenses with the Laowa MSC on my Canon R5 versus the 16 to 35 on my Sony A7R II with Sigma MC11 adapter. The 16 to 35mm on Sony is sharper than the 10 to 22 plus the Magic Shift Converter. It also seems sharper than the 10 to 18 plus Magic Shift Converter, but it's more difficult to compare there due to the difficulty in focusing the 10 to 18 on a dumb adapter like the Magic Shift Converter. So what about if we use a teleconverter to increase the image circle of the lenses to cover full frame? Unfortunately, my Sony teleconverter is not compatible with my E-mount EF lens adapters. However, I do have an EF mount Kenko CAF 1.4x DGX teleconverter, which is specially designed for use with EF-S lenses. Note that you lose a stop of light with a 1.4x teleconverter. And so here are the images taken with that Kenko teleconverter. With the TC, images are sharp in the centre but soft at the edges, particularly with the 10 to 22mm. There's also more chromatic aberration. Images with the Magic Shift Converter are better than with the teleconverter. So next we'll look at a comparison between all these. Here I'm comparing uncorrected images with lens profile corrections turned off and chromatic aberration correction turned off. From the crops you can see neither lens has particularly bad lateral chromatic aberration. Adding the Kenko DGX teleconverter does cause quite a bit of chromatic aberration, but all other combinations look pretty good. The 10 to 18mm lens seems to have more flare than the 10 to 22. However, at least with my copy of the 10 to 22, it seems to have more distracting flare that looks a bit like raindrops on the lens. I suspect this is dust inside the lens, as I can't see any marks or visible dirt on the front or rear elements of the lens. The Magic Shift Converter doesn't seem to make flare any worse. With the teleconverter, I would say this is worse than the native lenses. As you might imagine, the lens hoods for both lenses are designed for an APS-C image circle, and so using the lens hoods on full frame will just give you a lot of vignetting. Note that these images were taken on my Canon camera, and so they're at a slight angle due to the lens not being quite fully mounted in order to avoid the forced APS-C crop that Canon does. So in conclusion, the lenses can be used full frame, but they're a bit soft at the edges for my liking. You could use something like an APS-H crop and get a wider field of view than you would in APS-C mode for a given focal length, while retaining decent image quality. However, at least with my cameras, framing images for a 1.3x crop would be difficult as there's no way to do this in camera, and other than increased resolution, there's little benefit over just using the lens in APS-C mode at a wider focal length. The 10 to 18mm lens is a better lens in terms of image quality, weight and size than the 10 to 22. But if you want to use the lens on an adapter without electronic contacts, The focus by wire of the 10 to 18mm makes it extremely difficult to use, and the 10 to 22mm lens there is a much better choice. The Laowa Magic Shift Converter is okay, but you're much better off just getting a full frame lens than using an APS-C lens with the Magic Shift Converter to make it cover full frame. Image quality is better with a full frame lens, and for electronic lenses they are much easier to use when connected to the camera. I should point out that Laowa do market their adapter for use with their fully manual lenses, and using APS-C lenses on full frame is not the intended purpose of it. Image quality with the teleconverter is not good enough to be worthwhile in my opinion. So while technically you could use an EF-S wide-angle lens for both APS-C and full frame, it does not work out as well in practice as I had hoped.